Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the MedTech Impact Podcast, where you get to hear from leaders and innovators who are shaping the future of medical technology. I'm Kyle Cruz.
And I'm Richard Meiklejohn.
And we're your hosts of the show.
So today on the MedTech Impact Podcast, we are delighted to be joined by Eduardo Fonseca, CEO of XCath. Eduardo, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Kyle and Richard. Thank you for having me on. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, this is awesome. We are super excited to share the story. I understand you prefer or you go by Eddie, so we're going to refer to you by Eddie, if that's okay, through the chat.
Eddie's fine. Eddie, E, Eduardo, Ed, whatever works.
Awesome. And so, Eddie, when we kick things off, we do like to frame it for the audience and like to have that big problem statement up front. So please tell us, what is that big problem XCath is looking to solve?
So the ultimate vision is, if you imagine the world's leading cause of death and disability, the problems don't arrive that are larger than that. And this leading cause of death and disability, 15 million strokes, 5 million deaths, 5 million disabilities, second leading cause of death, leading cause of disability in the world. In 2015, a series of trials essentially uncovered that mechanical thrombectomy, the physical removal of the clot in the brain, is a near miraculous treatment with an NNT of anywhere between 2 and 3. This is the level of life-saving antibiotics numbers needed to treat. So you couple what I consider to be the world's greatest problem with an incredible solution, and the issue then becomes, how do you get this miraculous treatment to the masses? And XCath is about democratizing a near miraculous treatment and enabling the next wave of endovascular treatments. A few interesting things is our vasculature actually is individual vascular of any human being is enough to span twice around the world. So I have a firm view that this is the future evolution of medicine. The real minimalist invasive, it's just about how do we navigate these vessels. And we like to believe we're in the midst of a revolution that will significantly enhance patient outcomes.
And so stroke, as you say, a huge problem globally, and the numbers speak for themselves. You know, with the two types of stroke being ischemic and hemorrhagic, are you targeting both of these, or what's, you know, the bigger problem you're seeing in the standard of care that you're hoping to address?
Between 87 and 90% of them are ischemic. So that really is our focus. And that's what mechanical thrombectomy addresses. So I would put it in buckets. The first bucket is, how do you precisely navigate the vasculature of the human body, and how do you enable more procedures to be created? And how do you standardize outcomes? That's the first bucket. And the second is, how can you enable or democratize access to a miraculous cure for the masses? And our focus is very much not just US, but worldwide. This is one of these problems that can significantly increase human lifespans, decrease significantly human suffering. And just as an example, it's estimated, and this is going back to my finance days, anywhere between 0.6% and 2% of world GDP is spent dealing with stroke disability. So that's everything humanity produces. Let's take the lower end of that estimate. 0.6% of everything that humanity produces is spent addressing stroke disability. That, in my view, it's one of the world's greatest problems.
Wow. Well, that really frames it, I think, nicely, Kyle, in terms of this is a huge problem, and the numbers speak again for themselves when you're talking in billions.
Oh my gosh, billions. I mean, how about the stat on XCath's website? Eddie, your marketing director loves you right now because you are hitting all the information that's on the website here on this podcast. But something else that really stood out too was the $1 trillion impact too that these problems and challenges will have on the healthcare industry as well. So obviously, pretty significant challenge here. So, well, that kind of lines us up perfectly to really now delve into the solution that XCath is bringing to the market, right? So please tell us about your technology and how you're trying to help improve outcomes when it comes to these types of clot removal procedures.
Yes. So we went back to first principles, and first principles is, what is the mechanics of a clot? How does the endovascular system behave? How do different wires translate? And it was an exercise where the easiest pathway is you jump to a conclusion and then work backwards from there. Our engineers, it's a difficult problem if you go from the bottoms up and think, okay, we're going to arrive at a blank slate as if no technology existed, think of it holistically, and then try to develop technologies around that. And the first product, which was spun out of a lab in UT in 2017, after significant research, we have the leadership of that program is a postdoc who's been researching this and essentially his entire life since undergrad. And it's using electroactive polymers to deflect very small bits of material. So we have our own Class 11 clean room here in Houston, where we do electroactive polymer research. And what we've been able to develop is essentially a 0.014 guide wire that flexes. It's almost as if you look up to a hair and that hair flexes 90 degrees. And that solved the problem of how do you navigate inside the vasculature. And the analogy we use is the current system is you're going on a highway trying to reach an exit and you're bouncing off the walls trying to hit your exit. And again, this is a very vast system, the endovascular system. So that's the first solution. How do we get navigation at the tip? Then the second was, how do you roboticize and control the catheters? Robotics makes easy things hard, which is fine motor movements of human fingertips, and it makes hard things very easy, which is holding many different devices. So we looked at creating a local robot, so bedside, so essentially what is known today as a current generation of endovascular robotics, where the surgeon is looking at the patient, but it's connected by a cable, and that really allows precise navigation. That's our endpoint. And then we looked at the third element, which is, how do you enable access to mechanical thrombectomy to everyone that doesn't have access? And that's the telerobot that we showcased recently in Abu Dhabi. So it's three distinct products that all work synergistically together.
Yeah, nice, Eddie. You know what, Richard, what I love too is, well, I love the bumpers when I'm bowling because I'm never going to miss the pins, right? So, I mean, just having some fun here. I mean, it's almost like putting the bumpers up for that steerable guide wire there as it travels through those veins. And I just think it's really interesting too, because everyone's anatomy is so different, right? So I think being able to obviously incorporate those electronics to help you navigate through those very intricate, challenging areas so that you don't hurt the patient. I think that's brilliant. And it sounds like when you say bedside, Eddie, it sounds like this is something that is like, it's small enough where there's no real big capital equipment. Is that right?
That is correct. Most endovascular robots are actually relatively small. So yeah, it's not necessarily a large capital equipment. And unlike traditional soft tissue robotics, the disposable element isn't necessarily that expensive either. So we started with a baseline of, we want to ensure that our technology can democratize access throughout the entire world. So we can't create an expensive device that would only work for the developed world. We want this to really be a mission-driven company of essentially enhancing humanity. That's our ultimate mission.
It's brilliant. And, you know, making that access to that patient care is everything, right? So Eddie, you nailed it on the head there. And Richard, I mean, obviously when we're talking about, you know, providing access to the best type of care worldwide, it makes me think a lot about, you know, how XCath is, you know, going to market with their technology today.
I was thinking exactly the same thing there, Kyle. And you know, that analogy you were talking about the bowling ball, I was thinking, wow, some of the drivers around Boston could probably do with that sort of guide system, given how many walls we see them hit along the way. But yeah, it's fascinating because clearly you're building a platform technology. You know, you've got you know, the different tiers you were talking about here between the guide wire system and the robotic platform. And so when you think about that go-to-market, the other part is you're not just doing this in the US, you're spanning continents, America and Asia. So, you know, I'd love to start there about this sort of pan-continental approach you're taking. How does that come about in the fact that you're developing this, you know, in two different continents?
Yeah, so the first element is the guide wire is essentially design frozen. So we're taking that through regulatory approvals. That functions as a standalone device with a handheld. So that doesn't require the robotic system. It will be integrated into the robotic system, but it doesn't require it. So that allows us to essentially get to market sooner. Then we go into the robotic system, and the ultimate aim is a telestroke robot. We believe there's an entire community of companies trying to solve this issue. And one of our goals is to create awareness of the problem. So hopefully we have a broader community. And it's one of these rare instances where you would want more competitors trying to solve the problem if you really are driven by a mission to improve humanity. And we believe that the underlying technology is already there, and the underlying problem is there. From an economics point of view, and this ties into reimbursement and commercialization and everything else, a group of our KOLs did an amazing paper where they found out what should governments pay for one of these procedures under worst case outcomes, right? So the patient is, you know, it's a patient that may not necessarily be fully disabled, and, you know, and you take the broad range of statistics and you put them in worst case scenario economically, and their paper essentially points to, even if governments paid over $300,000 per procedure, because of the cost of the healthcare system of dealing with disabilities, it still makes economic sense. So then we go into how do you actually approach it? And our view is that the technology will be very close to being solved by multiple players, including XCath. It really then becomes a human factors issue. So we have a close consultant who's an astronaut. He's commanded both the Soyuz and the space shuttle. And this is a very similar problem than they faced in aviation and aerospace, which is, how do you manage risks when you don't know them? And how do you create the failure modes analysis? And it really is, what's the training? What's the recurrency? And that's how we're trying to approach that problem.
Wow, I love this mindset. I mean, the Rocket Man approach is pretty unique, I have to say, Kyle. But the other thing you keep on referring to is this democratizing accessibility. And that, to me, is really what great leadership is all about. When we think about healthcare, and we have a number of fantastic leaders on here, but, you know, we can't sort of emphasize enough the importance of making healthcare accessible to people all around the world. And so I love that mission and what you're stating there. You have had some pretty interesting projects on the go recently. I wonder if you can now tell us a little bit about what's been happening in Abu Dhabi.
Yeah, so, you know, going along the theme of technology, we've had the telerobotic capabilities for a while, and it really becomes about network engineering. And our South Korean robotics R&D campuses, they're just incredible engineers, and we've managed to create an entirely flat organization. The way we like to think about it is, there's no CEO of the company. There's just one person that's at the service of the rest, and every engineer owns their own project. So they're fully autonomous to make decisions, drive things. We map out risk, we map out strategy. Then it just becomes about execution. We pivot quickly, and we believe that led to the underlying technology. So we started solving it first telerobotically in the same room, then the next room, then the next floor, you know, on different floors of the building. We realized the engineers were trying to fix the network of the actual R&D building in Korea, and we realized that that's not what we're trying to do. Then we went across cities, then we went, you know, the opposite ends in Korea. And, you know, the network engineering was such that we really weren't noticing latency. So we were trying to find the problem, which we weren't finding, in order to solve it. And I'm a firm believer that if you want to find solutions, you really have to aim for the stars. You have to have a grand vision that is so seemingly impossible. It's almost sci-fi, and you have to pursue it, and then you'll land on the moon. So for us, one of those projects was, let's get worst case scenarios, time of the busiest network traffic, and let's do a transcontinental simulated mechanical thrombectomy. And let's do it in a public stage because there's pressure to execute. And the entire team took that sort of mission, and we had a date we had in mind. Dr. Vito Pereira, he did the world's first endovascular robotic procedure, and he's done by far the most in the world. He signed up to the challenge, and when we set everything up, we could only test the system when the conference was over. So at night, so it was late night Abu Dhabi. It was 3 a.m. in Korea. And the first time we tried it was actually at the conference itself, morning in Abu Dhabi, midday in Korea, worst conditions you could think of, through public networks. And that team is just spectacular. And they're so dedicated, working around the clock. And we ended up having 153 millisecond lag. So it's imperceptible, essentially. So the pivotal moment for the company is it's no longer a technology problem. There's a lot of issues to sort out, of course, but it really then becomes of how do you practically implement this? And there's not a lot of firm set rules in the company, but there is one. If we are a humanitarian company on a mission, and we will try this technology in patients, every teammate has a veto. And before we go into any patient, if anyone in the company raises their hand, we will immediately stop and we will go back to the drawing board. So then it's that next stage of how do we tackle this incredible problem in the most responsible and effective manner possible. And it will not be telerobotic. Telerobotic is the end game. We're working towards that. It's almost, you've solved the issue. Now you go all the way back to the beginning and say, let's take baby steps. Let's ensure that we can work out any kinks along the way and be very responsible about it.
That is totally awesome, though. I mean, putting yourself under pressure like that on a stage, I mean, it's really cool just to share that news, and just obviously it went well for you.
Yeah, I remember we had the Dr. Fred, he was doing the keynote after, and he's, well, you know, guys, it's this thing. I'm used to devices failing when you're doing these sort of demonstrations. So, you know, the team was incredibly proud. We had the team in Korea was actually on the call. So they were on a Zoom, essentially, a Zoom-like thing on the side. And yeah, you know, it's organization, success brings success. The team is firing on 12 cylinders, you know, and we're finally, I would like to say, on that path to where you no longer work for a company, you are a company, and you're yourself and you as a person sort of becomes this mission. And I like to believe that every member of this organization shares that same thought. You know, there aren't that many places where you could work and genuinely say your everyday work, your efforts, your sleepless nights, your drive could actually lead to saving potentially 5 million lives a year, right? Even a fraction of that problem is one worth tackling.
Nice. Well, Eddie, you mentioned a number of interesting points about, you know, some of the unknowns along the way. And I think that tees us up nicely to talk about that regulatory journey and pathway. So first off, very curious, is this a 510K? Is this a PMA? Because when you say unknowns and stuff that hasn't happened before, you know,
Yeah.
I'm not sure which direction we're going here. I need
Yeah.
your catheter. I need your steerable robotic catheter to guide me. So come on, help me out here.
Yeah, so I would say since 2019, if anyone's pitching a surgical robot through a 510K, then that's an immediate pass out of the room. So, so it is de novo. So we expect the local robot to be de novo. It's obviously in the neurospace, so it needs significant evidence. You know, we expect multi-center trials, significant animal evidence, human factors testing, significant EV, and telerobotics, to be honest, is the one capability that no one's approved. So obviously I wouldn't want to come here and try to steer you in the direction that it's a PMA, but it will not be easy. You know, one sort of common thing that we say here is this really isn't a medical problem. It's not a networking problem. It's not a robotics problem. It's an everything problem. So it's such a multifaceted problem that it really takes a lot of collaboration, and to de-risk those specific areas, I think, is a lot of effort, you know, from network engineering, redundancies. I think recurrency will be a huge element. You know, what happens in the case of adverse events, how recurrent do the bedside technicians have to be, how experienced, Who licenses physicians? What's that process like? We're the firm view that if physicians aren't comfortable and experienced doing procedures locally, they will never be comfortable doing them telerobotically. So that's our stepped approach of really approaching local robotics first, making inwards, getting a lot of data, fine-tuning our product, and then going telerobotically. So telerobotic is the grand vision. We are not racing towards it. We are approaching it very responsibly.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think it goes back to the kind of the human factors side of this too, right? Which is really interesting because we brought on a chief medical officer at our business, just even as a contract manufacturer, and this was a few years ago, probably about 5 years ago. And I will say that one of the big things he kept saying in the world of catheters, scopes, probes, and these new technologies, these really innovative technologies that have never been seen before coming to market, it's really all about human factors, right? And helping these people understand, how exactly it works, how to use them carefully, effectively. So it's all great points. Something else that stood out to me, and I want to just touch on reimbursement too real quick, because you mentioned that, if the government had to pay $300,000, it would still be worth the investment. So let's talk a little bit more about that reimbursement strategy. And do you also have kind of like an end goal where you hope it's going to cost kind of X amount, where maybe it might not be 300,000 or maybe it is? But what does that look like for XCath in your product?
Yeah, so for the first product, the guidewire, we fit within regular reimbursement codes. So that's sort of that area. Robotics, and I would love someone to debate me on this, but the way I've sort of seen it is every robotics adds cost, it adds complexity, and it adds time to procedures. I could be wrong, and I think hopefully platforms come out that don't add those three elements. So really the question becomes, what are you giving to payers, to patients, to physicians in exchange for cost, complexity, and time? And we believe for XCath, it'll be access, precision, hopefully it translates into better outcomes. So that's on that reimbursement side of the robot. On the telerobot, we do believe in the humanitarian angle of this. So we expect this to evolve in this similar way as other groundbreaking treatments. These technologies, I believe, will very quickly evolve into more of the diplomatic affairs angle of, this is now medical treatment that significantly improves human lifespans. How do you approach democratizing it? How do you approach making sure it's access and less of you can make a quick buck deploying this in X country, right? So I think the world hasn't had those conversations yet. I think those conversations will come very quickly, and they will come as soon as there's clinical evidence, probably in the developed world, where you have patient testimonials and stories of, I owe my quality of life thanks to these devices. And I'm standing on a stage saying it's a humanitarian and economic imperative for this to be democratized around the world. I don't think we're there yet, but with most things of technology, if you imagine smartphones didn't exist until very recently, and now suddenly no one can live with a smartphone, the pace of technology is they happen very slowly and suddenly very fast and very sudden. And I think this is one of these technologies that if we look back in 10, 20 years, a healthcare institution that doesn't have these capabilities, or a town or a country, it will be hard to find them because of the impact they can have on humanity.
Yeah, well, Eddie, there's no question that robotics is being talked about more and more, especially Richard. I think about our recent time at Device Talks Boston. Eddie, we might have to get you on stage to debate that one, because it's just really interesting to hear what everyone's saying about robotics. But nevertheless, we know that this is the direction that medical technology is going. It's happening right now. So yeah, it's just really exciting stuff.
Yeah, it's robotics is inevitable. I believe that it will help standardize outcomes. We have Dr. James Tudor is a radiologist out of Baylor. He leads our AI program. And the beauty of robotics is it captures significant amounts of data. And when you overlay that with new methods of imaging, I do believe that robotics, similar to, it started being necessarily a novelty, and now we're starting to see evidence of improved clinical outcomes. I do believe when it merges with these new technologies, it will be very obvious that that's the future. So don't interpret my cost, complexity, time argument as not being a fan. I just believe that if a company creates their entire value proposition around novelty and, this is, physicians will love playing with robots. I don't think that's the way to go. You really have to think of what are you offering in exchange for complexity, for cost, for time. And I do believe there's platforms out there that will prove me wrong, that will make procedures faster, that maybe they will reduce the cost. Complexity is a hard one. Robots are complex, but yeah, it's a very exciting field for sure.
Exciting is the word. I mean, Kyle, as you mentioned, it was so cool when we got this tour around Medtronic and got to see Hugo in action and even get a chance to play on it. And again, the amount of money that's being invested into this robotic technology, I think you're so right, Eddie, that we're going to see the fruition of this in the near-term horizon, as well as obviously longer into the future. And you stuck on so many challenges. I think about the complexity of the procedure, the technical aspects of developing this, addressing the economic challenges. As you look ahead and you're stratifying all these different risks, like what lies ahead for you in sort of the next 6 to 18 months? What's the most important things you want to hone in on?
For the next 6 to 18, I do believe it's the regulatory pathway of the guidewire. That's really important. Creating reliable devices, so mechatronics, network engineering is definitely our focus. But in parallel, and I'm trying to find a parallel to it, and I think aviation is really an amazing example. If you think of the complexity of getting in a metal tube that's pressurized in a hostile environment, 500 miles an hour, and it's only safe to land in a specific place around meteorology and adverse weather. Aviation and airplanes should be by far the most dangerous way to travel, yet it's actually by far the safest. And why was that? A regulator that was pragmatic and learned from essentially from anything that went wrong. That's a key area. And I think the FDA has that mindset of really learning and being evidence-based. And there was airplanes travel around the defined set pathways, and I think that's network engineering. And they have very strict protocols of what the airplane can do, who can fly it, and who's able to support it from a maintenance point of view. So I think the parallels are there. It really is transferring what has been little over 100 years of aviation into telerobotics and creating early on those conversations to create global standards around this is what's considered safe and recurrent, and this is how that industry will develop in a safe manner. So I think that's going to be the hardest challenge. It's not the technology piece. It will really be how do we roll this out, democratize it, and make it incredibly safe for patients.
Yeah, and I think the other point you make there is around that symbiotic relationship between humans and machines, and clearly this is a big future part about by benefiting from what machine can do better than a human while still taking the best parts of the human ingenuity, then I think we can really leverage that going forward, Kyle. And clearly there's a lot of partnerships going into this. I think Eddie has sort of laid out in a little bit some of the details going on here, but I think there's probably a little bit more in terms of the team and the partners involved.
Richard, it's incredible, right? What I love too, what Eddie was saying is how he went about, even building out his team, Eddie, I think it's just incredible, how you leverage people from aviation and, aerospace, and you've got a former, astronaut on your team. I mean, it's super neat to hear. So I guess, to Richard's point, what does the future look like for your team? Are you looking to add more folks to your team? Are you looking for that unique kind of out of the box person that can come in and bring this perspective and bring this area of expertise that can actually help you overcome some of these challenges that might not be just your everyday medical device person? What kind of, and of course, other partnerships, what does that look like?
Yeah, so we have a broad set of partnerships. So a lot of our guidewire fast iteration and prototyping is actually being done out of Galway in Ireland, where there's that ecosystem. In South Korea, it's the world's most roboticized country. And we just find when you can create a robot and it's a concept drawing to a robot in 90 days, that's sort of been our goal, and we're there, rapid prototyping. And you could only do that if you have the supply chains nearby. So real expertise. Obviously, talent is the biggest one. These companies are not devices. These companies are people, and that's where the value lies. So we really work hard to ensure that we hire slow and we hire people that are driven by a mission to change the world. We don't have any remote employees. Everyone that works for XCath has made a sacrifice to move themselves, if they're not local. And what we found is what that does is your circle of friends, family, support, everything revolves around the company. So, it's essentially once you make that decision, you're all in. And I think that plays to sort of our culture where there has to be complete trust, right? Problems have to move up the chain much faster than opportunities. People have to have that team effort of, I love your idea, but I think you're wrong. Let's debate it. We have a lot of competition. So if at any point we don't have, we don't see eye to eye on the technology, we create little groups that essentially create competition. And then we host a Shark Tank sort of panel with KOLs, and they're the judges. You have to avoid, I think one of the biggest pitfalls is, the founder CEO with a great vision, and then he just finds KOLs that agree with his vision, and you don't listen to anyone else. That's I think a moral sin. So I think management really has to adopt the role of, you're at the service of your people. You're not there to create visions. You're there to support engineers and try to foster as much communication between your engineers and the KOLs. And as a case example, no one in the company owns the KOL relationships. Everyone has cell phones or physicians. If they have questions, they call them and they go to their labs. We have open lab days in Korea with Dr. Shin, who's an amazing physician. And exposing engineers to the clinical setting is actually where our best ideas have come from. So really avoiding those biases, I think, is really important.
Well, you make it fun, you make it competitive, you're super empathetic, and you're incredibly real. Everything we've heard today in this podcast has just been, you've been spoken like a true leader, right? And it's very inspiring. So we would love to hear, and if you could share with the audience, maybe what are, 1 to 3 couple tips that you would have for someone looking to maybe, work for an early stage innovative company like yours, or even try to develop and start a medical device company like XCath?
Oh, so very good question, Kyle. The first one I would say is humility. I think leaders that know what they don't know are more effective than those that focus on what they do know. I think the second is resilience. If you approach the problem appropriately, you will be constantly humbled by things you don't know and problems you don't arise. So it really, the analogy we use is, you are almost like a racehorse pursuing that one path and executing and really driving and laser focused. So you have to have that mentality. You can't be pivoting all the place, right? You have to have a laser focus towards an endpoint, but you also have to have the mentality that you can pivot at any moment, immediately, as soon as you hear the better idea. And the third really is the value of teamwork. You have to get along together. Grapevines and lack of trust destroy companies, destroy cultures, and that psychological safety in this industry, I think, is incredibly important, because if there isn't that culture of openness and sharing problems, that could translate down the road into harming a patient. So I think is the value of teamwork and fostering a great relationship amongst all colleagues is incredibly important.
That's such great advice, Eddie. And every time you're talking and you're giving these different tips, I'm thinking it's just one big family. The XCath family, all those values that you're espousing here, I can fully understand why somebody would want to be part of that family, because you have all these key values, you have this key mission. I wonder now, just as we look to wrap things up, when somebody does join that family, like, what's that vision that you're painting to them? Because I know you've touched on it a little bit at the beginning here, but when someone comes to on board, what are you telling them? And what's that sort of outlook? You say, like, 10 years down the road, this is where we'd like to be.
Actually, my job is relatively easy because most of our teammates have had, most of humanity has had some friend or family that they could point to and say their life was affected by a stroke. I know that patient passed away, or their life is incredibly difficult and their family is incredibly difficult thanks to something that could have been solved. So really capturing that frustration of we have this amazing treatment and it's not being democratized in the developing world. It's not being democratized in the developed world. You know, less than half of Americans live within a 1-hour drive to a thrombectomy center. You know, and this treatment's delivered by, you know, if there's one area where I've found incredible admiration is the KOLs that have actually decided to make their life treatment. I mean, that's talk about quality of life, talk about exposure to one's health through radiation, and these are the superheroes of our modern world. So and every teammate that, you know, you capture this frustration, you capture there's a solution to the problem. It's a hard one, but it's there, and you can actually make a real impact in humanity. This can be your dent in the world, where you can go back and tell your next generation, hey, I was involved in something that was great, and it became standard of care. I just don't think a lot of areas. So I think it's an incredible blessing and opportunity to be able to be involved in this. And I think it's our responsibility to raise awareness of the problem and of the solution, and hopefully that the best minds come together and try to solve this. You know, either with XCath or found your own companies that try to compete with XCath. You know, I think at this stage, it really is about having as many people try to solve this problem as possible. It's a big world, it's a big industry, and it's a big solution. So there's space for everyone.
Awesome. And Eddie, so you have a bunch of people that will be listening to this podcast that are going to want to work with you and partner with you. You're going to have venture capital people that are going to want to literally empty out their bank accounts and give you everything they have. And then you're going to have some really big companies that probably want to acquire you. So what is the best way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, it's very easy. My cell phone is 713-515-2065. That's my cell phone. So you can send me a message.
That's a first right there on the show.
Yeah.
A cell phone number. Wow.
And
Eddie,
my
you are
email,
brave, man.
Yeah, efonseca@xcath.com.
Yeah.
If I don't answer the first one, send me a message and I'll answer the second one. But that is my cell phone.
Awesome.
Amazing, man. Well, I can imagine so many people are going to be wanting to join you on this space mission for creating impact. That's a word we love. So thank you so much, Eddie, for joining us. And of course, wishing you and the team well with the future mission.
Really appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me on. It was a great pleasure.
Awesome. Well, ladies and gentlemen, another huge thank you to Eddie Fonseca, the CEO of XCath. And thank you for tuning in for another episode of the MedTech Impact Podcast. I'm Kyle Cruz.
And I'm Richard Beaglejohn. Until next time, keep innovating.